Well, I did it quite young. I was very much a generalist, and I don't think anybody kind of knew what they wanted to do with me or where I wanted to go. I liked sciences, I liked art, etc. So to some extent, I was led to it because it covered so much. So that's a good start. And I actually did an A level in archaeology, and I started having an interest in things of the past, I'd say, since I was in my early teens. But as I looked at it more and more, there were lots of reasons. I wanted the lifestyle. I really didn't want an ordinary, boring job. I didn't want to get up every morning, commute into London, do a job, come back, or whatever it might be. I had a parent, a father who had quite a free lifestyle and could organise how he did his job. So I didn't want a boss, as it were. I liked things to do with objects. I used to go around auction rooms and sort of houses that had been cleared with my father. I always wondered about the objects that people left behind and the people that were behind them. And I also wanted to be outdoors. I loved the landscape. I never wanted to do a job that was always indoors. I wanted to travel. I wanted to see different ways of doing things. I was always quite shy, but I actually liked teaching people about things that I was interested in, as you had to do at school, talk about a subject that interests you. So I think it just suited me because it was so big and it covered so much, and there were so many different ways of steering your path through it. You asked, did I have much external encouragement? That's a bit vague because I never really said what I wanted to do. So it was sort of left open. I didn't come from an academic family. And when I finally declared archaeology, my father said to me, "You'll never make any money and you'll never meet anybody with any money." Well, both of those things have proved to be wrong. I've had a pretty good career and funding out of it. But he did come up to me after he'd said that and said, "If you really want to do it, I've bought this book for you." And it was an old second-hand book called Directing Archaeological Excavations by John Alexander. And he said, "If you really want to do this, aim for the top." So it was good advice, and I've had a lovely career. Well, that's an interesting one because I've found every one of them challenging. So I'll tell you different ways in which they're challenging. I started off as a finds expert, so I would go onto sites and look at the ceramics, etc. And I decided I wanted to have more control over where I went, what I did, and look at wider things. And therefore I started running excavations and field work. So my challenges, I started off working in Britain and the challenge was the weather. I spent 5 years excavating on Bodmin Moor. It rained for 2 months every year there. So this is in Cornwall, in an upland area. It was very difficult to see anything. It was very stony. But I'd say the weather, I got trench foot and I was just every day I had to put on soil bags, waterproofs, anything to keep the weather out. So after that, I decided I wanted to work in another part of England. So I worked on a hill fort. I excavated a hill fort in Sussex. And that was a challenge because I'd have to say at that stage, anybody who excavated a hill fort was a big, strong man. And I was a rather small female. And so it was kind of challenged psychologically that I could suggest how to do it and knew how to do it. It was also a challenge, all of them were, because I never did things the conventional way. I was interested in phenomenology and sensory archaeology, and those were things that people didn't trust and I had to fight to do, not as a separate thing, but in addition to all the other things you did. And then I moved on. I got really fed up with the weather in the UK and I moved on to Italy. And I worked in the south of Italy. And what was my biggest challenge? The heat. It was always 40 degrees. It was one of the few semi-arid regions of Europe. And it was a challenge because you couldn't see anything. I mean, it was all there. You had all the aerial photographs, but all you had was heat and crops. So it was quite a challenge to do things like phenomenology, sensory archaeology, think about these sites when they were sort of invisible. But I liked that. And after several years, I've now, with Ruth Whitehouse, got the book out of this project. And I think it comes together very well as conventional archaeology and sensory archaeology. And finally, and in parallel, I work in the Pacific now. And I think this is a real challenge to anyone, that you say, I'm not going to work where I normally work. I'm going to go somewhere completely different where I've never worked and think about landscapes. So I went off to the remoted inhabited place in the world and got a grant to do it, which is Easter Island or Rapa Nui. And apart from the heat again and the remoteness, I think working with local communities, it's their island. They're very, very careful and possessive of it. It's their right to be. And just how you negotiate with Indigenous communities and local people and come to a relationship with them, that you can co-work with them in what is essentially their environment. So there are my challenges: not doing standard things, the weather, working with local communities, classic things you might do as a female or not, etc. To some extent, I didn't. I've always been quite self-contained, but through time, I began to see the value of it. So it wasn't there at the start. And I got two people I might mention. One is actually just a friend I've had since I was at university, who's French, not English, and was very successful in libraries of sort of antique texts and things. So it wasn't really archaeology, but she had such a full life. She really enjoyed life. She didn't make it a burden or restricting that she had an academic career or a sort of career in management. So she taught me to enjoy life and not just be sort of consumed by the struggle of success. And I've always found that helpful. So sometimes I step back and just think what's really good rather than what's pressurized. And then the other mentor I've had, or friend, for a lot of my life is who I work with in Italy, who's Professor Ruth Whitehouse. And she, again, is somebody who's just taken archaeology to the full. She's got children, grandchildren. She always took them into the field with her. She never let being what else she wanted to be in terms of having a full life be something that interfered with or separated her work. And I think that's fair to all people in any academic thing, that it's not just something where you're singular. You have to have accommodation for people's lives. But the other thing I would say about Ruth is she's much more political than me. If I'm kind of worried about the right way or the wrong way to do something, she's just got a natural politics in her that she makes me wise and just think carefully before I do something. And I always remember a previous director, when we went into academic meetings, when Ruth and I went in, he'd say, "Here comes trouble." And it's because she taught me to speak out, but don't fight every battle, choose your battles. Well, archaeology is a creation in terms of UK archaeology and many countries' archaeology that goes back into the 19th century. So it's a creation of privileged males very often. So it's got a kind of culture that came through into the 20th century, which wasn't defined in what was written about it or how it was done by females. So you have a kind of past that explores things that don't necessarily explore a whole community, be it children, females, people of different orientations, etc. So I think that was something that struck me very strongly. And when I entered archaeology, there weren't many females who stayed in it. So I was always in a minority. So this seemed to me, given that archaeology is about past human behaviour in its fullest whole, there were a lot of faceless people there, and there were a lot of people that were missed out in the consideration of archaeology. So I think that's one reason why I think it's important. I also think it's important in terms of who does what in archaeology, because I started off as a ceramicist, and there just didn't seem to be a career structure in commercial archaeology for a lot of people who worked on small finds, which is what I did at the start. There was a career structure that was project management and via the field route, and that was male orientated. And it was a very macho culture at that time. Things have changed a lot, so it's important in the present because there are so many females doing archaeology. So there's this great thrust of change if you think about the institute and how many undergraduates are female versus male. So it's really important that there is a comfortable and productive place politically for them to thrive in. And also, there's just so many issues in the world that just need a more complete view than the skews that it's had in the past. So modern archaeology doesn't just relate to the past, it relates to what you do in the present with archaeology that makes a better future. And that's a multi-gendered and a multi-ability world. Yes, so since I've been at the Institute as director, which is 7 years, we've had numerous staff appointments. Some of them are short-term contracts to replace people who are on, let's say, a sabbatical. Some of them are full-time positions to replace people who've retired and resigned or whatever. And I'm really not absolutely sure of the number of full-time posts which have come up during that time in the academic staff, but it might be, say, 9. And of those 9, only 2 are males. So first of all, there has been a complete shift in appointment, but it's what you might call the pipeline, because most of the appointments are at a junior level, because this is how an institution works financially. As a professor retires, it releases money to have a replacement, but at a junior level. So I'd say we've got a very good looking pipeline, but that's different. You can't make somebody a female professor if she's at the beginning of her career. So the pipeline hasn't been good, but I think we've done a lot to change that. And one of the things I think that has helped change it is what I call very open and fair recruitment, which is that you make the criteria absolutely clear what they are, and you interview everyone who fulfills all the criteria. So you look very carefully at all the applications. And I think by thinking about the range of criteria that the Institute needs and doing this very rigorously, it has actually brought more female choices as the preeminent person to give the job to. So I think fair and careful recruitment in terms of laying out what you want is important as well. The number of females that are professor is 2. There's myself and another. So what we need is to get lots of females into the associate professor category, which is the one below professor. And they're champing at the bit. I'm really excited by our female appointments. I think they're going to give the males a really good run for their money. They're getting lots of grants. They're taking on lots of high profile things. So I think it's looking exciting. Support staff, yes, that is traditionally female in terms of numbers, and I think it would be throughout UCL. I think we should also not just think about male and female, but just the kind of diversity of different backgrounds and different cultural units that people come from. And I think UCL as a whole is much better at that. You can only but set out a good job specification and essential criteria and see what comes to you. I'd say there's another thing which is unequal, which is we've now got so many females in our student population. So you might say we should there be actually looking, for instance, to, I don't know, males from low economic backgrounds or difficult cultural contexts, or people who just have got more of a struggle in life. So I think we've got to look much more widely to make our mix of student recruitment better, which is sort of race, economics, as well as gender. So we're getting there, and I think I have made a difference, but it's quite a long way to go from a low starting point. And the Institute for a long time had very little staff movement. So if people don't resign or retire, you don't have the gap there to do it. But watch this space. Well, I'm really excited because particularly via our critical heritage studies, I think we make it quite clear that archaeology is not about the past, and what you do now with archaeology at its broadest range actually will impact upon and meet the future. And of course, archaeology relates to a huge time depth, which the present doesn't. The present's small. So archaeology has so much learning to contribute in the present to make a better future. And I'm excited by a lot of things that are broadening it out. So I think sustainability and the Anthropocene is a sort of really great theme that we can all contribute to with the wisdom of the past, how you make sustainable communities, ancient crops that give you more sustainability at the time of climate change than present crops, that sort of thing. I think the technology of archaeological science is just fantastic, and we've invested millions in new equipment. You know, how you can tell how much people travelled in the past. You never expected how far they travelled from isotopic analysis is just one example. You know, the technologies, the work we're doing on the terracotta army, for instance, and how different things were made and the technologies behind it. And I think all these things are gifts to the future because they provide alternatives, different ways of living, different social hierarchies. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced archaeology is the key topic to get us into the future and beyond. So I think it's really, really exciting. And I do think there's still a kind of sense for those who don't know that archaeology is something to do with old bits of pottery and old buildings and things. And it's the Institute's mission to show how totally relevant it is to all aspects of living and being as a human being, associated with plants and animals and all the resources around us. Well, for me, it is that females are largely there, and they weren't when I was doing it. And I think it's critical, a critique of what archaeology tells you, which I've been talking about previously, for the future. I mean, I think it's great that, for instance, critical heritage is looking at nuclear waste as a resource that is stored in the present, like any other heritage. It's providing a heritage of some sort for the future. So that inheriting something in the present that you will collect and pass on to the future or not. So it's a kind of very central subject. But one of the saddest things is that it's not taught so often at school anymore. So it's been lost from the UK school syllabus, yet it is such a relevant thing, as said, for understanding alternative ways of sustaining the future. And I'm sure they do, you know, the outside world thinks you kind of go around looking at antiquities rather than thinking about whole social and environmental systems. Well, there's two types of advice, or advice to anybody, actually. And one is what on earth you think you must or have to do to get a career and succeed. But the other is how to have a satisfying life, which includes a job or a profession that works well for you. And I've always tried myself to be myself and believe in myself. So I wasn't moved by the way other people ran their careers. I decided I could only do it by being myself. So I would say that to anyone, but I think sometimes females need more confidence to be told, be yourself and believe in yourself. I've also think, and it again relates to not just females, but you have to be prepared for things to take time. I mean, it took a really, really long time before I got a full-time lectureship. I did all sorts of things, but I wasn't going to give up. And I think that happens not just to females, but there are people, and it's unavoidable. They're like arrows. They just let their arrow off and they go just like that to the point they want to be at. But sometimes life's more difficult if that happens to you because you haven't seen all the ups and downs and the other difficulties. So be yourself, believe in yourself, and talk to other people about it, which is not just have a mentor, but just talk to people who are of your type and will discuss it with you. Well, I could have said a failure because I was just so unpacific, except this thing. And then I could have become many things. So there are kind of lists that's really odd. I think my parents wanted me to do law and become a lawyer. And there was at one point where I was finding it so difficult to earn any money in archaeology, I signed myself up for an interview to law school. And I went to this august place and I sat in the reception room and looked at everyone coming in. And I thought, I can't do this. I can't give up archaeology. So law wasn't for me. This is where it looks so unacademic. The things would include an organic cheese maker. I'm totally obsessed by cheese and pastures. And I used to arrange archaeological trips every year for people who would pay for my petrol and the hotel. And every other stop point was an organic cheese farm. And I'd give them all the grid references and they'd say, is it a cheese farm or a piece of archaeology? So it went quite well together in the landscape. And I think it's because I'm interested in how things are made and how animals are looked after. And it's a whole sort of subsistence thing through. Then another one was, I could have been a viticulturalist. I'd love to have owned a vineyard or be a wine merchant. Doesn't sound academic either. But I just love all that tending of vines and, you know, different tastes of wine and things. Then another one again is a renovator of old buildings, which I do in my spare time. And my father was in the building industry, and I like building sites and old bits of stone and things like that. So there's a pretty wide range there, and they don't sound at all academic, but I think it's just a love of lots of aspects of life. And archaeology brought them all together. Well, I'm very, very supportive of TrowelBlazers, and I think it's great to just have different stories about different people. I once did a study of Ruth Whitehouse, in fact, when she retired, and I had her life sort of with all the dates going down one side and columns, and it had family, fieldwork, teaching, etc. And it was fascinating because different things happened at different speeds in different columns. And I think that's again why having an understanding of the diversity of people is important. So you could see where she had her family and the types of things she carried on doing and the things that were less able to carry on with. It was just very fascinating in terms of how people even out their ways. But my final thing is there are many ways of being good. And that's the thing I want to emphasize as a female, that there are many ways of being good and they should be recognized in the system.